Hello, it's Stephanie again. We're going to talk a little bit more about codependency. As we're taking a deep dive into a look into what addiction is, how it affects the family, let's talk about codependency and how that can build amongst family members. Ultimately, when we look at codependency, it kind of arises out of this aspect of fear and love for our loved ones, safety, survival, all about those aspects. When we get to understand the impact of codependency or co-addiction and understanding the progressive cycle and beginning to recognize those behaviors, those are the aspects that we can really change and help promote a more healthy system, a healthy family system. So what is codependency? It's essentially a pattern of compulsive behaviors resulting in painful dependence on our addicted loved one. Plain and simple, it tends to really affect not just our perception, but our inner reality and our addicted outer reality, especially in terms of our loved one. Oftentimes, too, we start beginning to lose ourself in this process because we're so hyper-focused on other people, places, and things that our inner self becomes disrupted and our self-esteem disintegrates, and we start taking on the feelings and actions and behaviors of our addicted loved one. So when we're looking at codependency, we're really looking at enabling behaviors. So what is enabling? And it's essentially protecting our loved one from those much needed consequences. And so essentially, like if I drive over the speed limit, I get pulled over, I get a ticket, that consequence more than likely is going to make me realize, like, hey, slow down, drive the speed limit, pay attention to your surroundings and those types of things. And there's a big learning element to those consequences. However, based on some fear and other aspects, we tend to take those pieces far. We have to understand the difference between what's loving and caring and what is co-addictive behaviors and those codependency aspects. Ultimately, the biggest aspect is awareness. The more that we are aware, the more that I'm able to make those changes, especially when I'm really wanting my addicted loved one to succeed in recovery. So let's talk a little bit about co-addiction, codependency, and what that might mean. So ultimately, there's different stages of what this looks like. Much like there are stages of addiction, there are stages of co-addiction. And that first one is learning to cope, stage one. That's where anxiety starts kicking in. We're starting to get a vague understanding that something's off, something's not right. There's a need to intensify that bond. Think about the example I used in the previous discussions, where when somebody gets sick, we tend to kind of jump in and, here, I made you soup. I'm bringing you some water. I called the doctor for you. And so we start really getting more of that, like, hey, I need to become more connected. I need to understand what this is and reeling that person in closer, which can really impact the level of stress and pressure that we're starting to feel. We're starting to get maladaptive behaviors to cope with that. And we're really preoccupied and overemphasis on our addicted loved one. Second stage, this is kind of where we're shifting out of like the feelings and moving into more of action. Because oftentimes when we start recognizing that there is confirmation that there is in fact an issue, drugs, alcohol, or process becomes a piece, there's some initial reactions that could be that shock, like, I can't believe this, I don't know what to do, or even like denial, like nothing's wrong. But then there's also this intense amount of fear. There's also frantic search for solutions. And ultimately, assuming accountability, taking on the fault, blaming myself, or, really starting to feel guilty for the situation. So then it's kind of like that seeking and needing for control, which then adds to like a little bit more action. Then stage 3 turns into more of this preoccupation and almost obsessive levels of thinking, where these maladaptive behaviors become more compulsive. Anxiety and pain starts to increase in the way in which that we deal with our person. Our protective defenses really start taking over. And sometimes it's almost like I can't feel good until I know this, and I got to get involved. You know, over assuming such amount of large accountability now it starts to feel like me and my addicted loved one are one. What you do to you is what you do to me. What I do to me is what I do to you. And it's getting harder and harder to have autonomy in this because every decision I make is based on how this will impact that other person, despite what I may need or want in this moment. And then last but not least is the obsession with the issue. And because there's been failed attempts at solutions, failed attempts at communication, sometimes even failed attempts at rectifying aspects, this still creates a ton of fear where it becomes almost crippling and shut down. And so there's this loss of being able to be objective about the aspect, and we're really kind of moving into more emotional reactive aspects without more or less thinking or being reasonable. Collapse of emotional structure, where like my happiness and my sanity and my safety is all contingent on what my loved one is or isn't doing. And often escape is sought through my own addiction, separation, isolation, suicidal thinking or ideation, depression, or flat out rejecting. Like this has become so overwhelming. It's so burdening to me that I have to start fighting back against you. And so, how does that work? It's like an unawareness of how I feel and an overwhelming response of being able to predict others' needs, wants, and feelings. I'm not aware of what I want, but I'm totally aware of what you want. Those types of things, and just over assuming these aspects, anticipating their need, anticipating their desires, anticipating what they're going to say next, and owning it as if it's mine, which then tends to create issues. There's a breakdown in what that looks like for me. Obviously, it diminishes outside of relationships. If I'm so preoccupied and tunnel vision on one, it's taking away from other aspects. It may be affecting my job. It may be affecting my marriage. It may be affecting my other relationships. So there's these breakdowns in these pieces. If I'm becoming so intertwined and enmeshed with this person and dependent, now we're both dependent on each other, then it's really hard to create that separation and autonomy. And so how do I get that back? Turns out, ultimately having to be comfortable and learning to be comfortable to meet my own needs and recognize that I cannot get them sober, and pulling it back into myself is going to be key features here in building a recovery in this entire system. When I recognize these aspects of codependency, co-addiction, and how much that can really solidify these dysfunctional behaviors within the family, I have to start recognizing I have to start meeting my own needs. I have to work my own plan. They have to work their own. I cannot shield my loved one from their consequences. That is going to be something that they have to face. I can share with my loved one my concerns. However, ultimately, at the end of the day, the best I can do is me. And that's as good as that kind of gets. This is where the help of a therapist or even intensive outpatient And in some cases, inpatients for codependency is much needed, because when we're looking at that system, all kind of being contingent upon one another with that cohesion and balance, when I start pulling away, it creates disharmonious aspects within the family. And so getting my own treatment is necessary to create better outcomes for my addicted loved one, and recognizing these levels of pieces. If I'm engaging in enabling, that isn't always loving. So what is the difference? Support and love isn't going to help problem solve or do for them as they should be doing for themselves, especially when we're looking at adults, right? And so thinking about those aspects are pivotal in these types of situations to recognize that, I have my own work to do.